The year is 1817. The British Empire does not look like an empire when you stand inside it. From the outside, it is maps shaded in red, fleets cutting across oceans, and proclamations nailed to wooden doors in distant lands. But from within, it is paperwork, silence, and men who disappear without anyone asking why. He was born into loyalty, not the kind sung in taverns or preached from pulpits, but the quieter loyalty that seeps into a boy raised on stories of empire, discipline, and duty. His father had worn the uniform of the crown during the wars against revolutionary France. His uncles had served in India, in Ireland, in places whose names were spoken with pride and fear in equal measure. Service was not a choice. It was inheritance. By the age of 17, he wore the red coat himself. Training broke him quickly and rebuilt him more efficiently. He learned to march until his feet bled, to fire until his shoulders numbed, to obey without pause and without question. The British Army did not demand love for the empire. It demanded usefulness. Anything beyond that was irrelevant. He was sent east, not to glory, not to conquest, but to containment. The post was an old colonial stronghold, once important, now forgotten, used mostly as a holding point for prisoners, dissenters, and soldiers who had learned too much. Officially, it was a garrison. Unofficially, it was a place where problems were stored until they stopped being problems. First, he believed. He believed in the order he enforced, in the law he upheld, in the idea that the empire, brutal as it sometimes was still preferable to chaos. He escorted prisoners whose crimes were never explained to him. He guarded men who spoke perfect English but were listed as local agitators. He noticed contradictions and filed them away, telling himself that higher authorities understood things he did not. Then came the documents. He was assigned clerical duty during a fever outbreak that killed half the senior officers. It was temporary, they said, just copying reports, just sealing letters, just transporting ledgers from one office to another. But ink has a way of revealing truths that gunfire hides. He saw names erased after executions that never occurred on record. Supplies charged to regiments that no longer existed. Orders signed by men who had been dead for years. Prisoners transferred on paper to locations that had burned down decades earlier. Most soldiers would have looked away. He did not. Not at first. Curiosity is dangerous inside systems that depend on silence. He asked one question too many, quietly, respectfully, to an officer who smiled as if nothing were wrong. 3 weeks later, he was arrested. There was no trial, no accusation read aloud, just a charge written once and never repeated: betrayal of the crown. The irony would have been amusing if it were not fatal. He was stripped of his uniform before sunrise. The red coat was taken carefully, folded as if it still mattered. His name was removed from the rolls. By nightfall, he was no longer a soldier. He was a problem. They transported him inland. The prison was not on any official map. It had no name that appeared in London records. Locals called it by an old word that meant mouth of stone. It had been a fortress once, then a colonial detention site, then something else entirely. Its walls were thick enough to swallow sound. Its corridors bent in ways that confused the sense of direction. Time inside it stretched and compressed unpredictably. Here, betrayal meant survival measured in years rather than hours. The cell they placed him in smelled of rust, damp cloth, and something older. Something like despair that had soaked into the stone itself. Chains were unnecessary. The walls did the work. Days passed without acknowledgement. Food arrived irregularly. Sometimes it did not arrive at all. Guards spoke rarely, and when they did, it was never to answer questions. Names were not used. Numbers were safer. At night, he listened. He listened to coughing that ended abruptly, to prayers spoken in multiple languages, to screams that began human and ended as something else. He learned quickly that the prison did not aim to punish. It aimed to erase, to reduce men until even memory rejected them. And still he survived. Not because he was stronger, but because he was patient, because he observed, because he learned when to speak and when silence was the only currency that mattered. He stopped thinking like a soldier and began thinking like a prisoner. That shift saved his life. But survival came with a cost. Each day inside that place chipped away at something invisible. Loyalty, identity, the idea that betrayal was a single act rather than a slow realization that the country you served never intended to protect you. He did not yet know how long he would remain there. He did not yet understand that the prison was only the beginning. What he knew, lying awake in the dark, was that the empire he had trusted had not destroyed him out of anger, but out of efficiency. And that made it far more dangerous. The days inside the prison did not move forward. They folded into one another. Morning and night were announced not by light, but by routine. The scrape of metal along stone, the distant cough of a guard, the sound of a bowl placed outside the bars. Sometimes the bowl contained thin porridge. Sometimes only water. Sometimes nothing at all. Hunger was not used as punishment. It was used as atmosphere. He stopped counting days early. Numbers gave the illusion of control, and the prison tolerated no illusions. Instead, he measured time by changes in himself. The way his hands trembled less when the cold set in. The way his thoughts slowed, becoming deliberate, careful, as if moving too fast might alert something unseen. He was not alone, though isolation was absolute. Through the walls he sensed others. Prisoners whose languages he did not understand. Prisoners who spoke English with accents from places the empire pretended not to know. Once, late at night, a voice whispered a name, his name, through a crack in the stone. He did not answer. Names were dangerous things here. To respond was to admit existence. Weeks, perhaps months, passed before he was questioned. They brought him to a room without windows, lit by oil lamps that smoked heavily. 3 men sat at a table. None wore uniforms. That detail unsettled him more than chains would have. They did not accuse him. They asked about what he had seen, what he had copied, what he had understood. They spoke calmly, as if discussing weather or trade routes. Each question assumed guilt as a foundation, not something to be proven. He answered carefully. Truth, but trimmed of emphasis. Honesty without interpretation. He had learned quickly that lies were easier to detect than curiosity. One man smiled faintly. You believed the empire was clean, he said. Not a question, an observation. Another leaned forward. And when you discovered it was not, you believed that mattered. That was when he understood. This was not about betrayal. It was about awareness. They did not punish traitors. They punished witnesses. After that interview, conditions changed, not for the better but for the stranger. He was moved to a different wing. Fewer screams reached him there. More whispers did. Prisoners in this section were not broken men. They were unfinished ones. Men who had survived long enough to be useful. An older prisoner eventually spoke to him through the wall. His voice was hoarse, disciplined, like someone who had once given orders. You were military, the voice said quietly. Yes, so were we, the voice replied. Before we became inconvenient. From him, the soldier learned the true purpose of the prison. It was not simply to erase men. It was to store them, to keep them alive, controlled, forgotten, until their knowledge was no longer dangerous, or until it could be exploited. Some prisoners were released years later, shipped to remote colonies under false names. Others were offered work. Intelligence gathering, translations, quiet negotiations with local powers. All without records. All deniable. Those who refused disappeared. Survival, he realized, was not enough. Survival was the baseline. The real question was what shape survival would take. His body adapted faster than his mind. He learned to sleep sitting up, to conserve strength, to ignore pain that had no solution. He observed guards' habits, the shift changes, the pauses between patrols. Not with escape in mind, escape was impossible, but with understanding. Understanding was power, even here. Once, a young guard hesitated before locking his cell. Their eyes met. The guard looked away quickly, ashamed. That moment told him something important. Not everyone here believed in what they were doing. Years passed. He grew a beard that was never properly cut. His hair thinned. His reflection, glimpsed once in a bucket of water, startled him. He looked older than his age, but not defeated. There was something colder in his eyes now, something precise. Eventually, they summoned him again. This time, the room was different, cleaner, brighter. Tea was served. The men spoke of unrest beyond the prison walls. Whispers of rebellion, colonial resistance, shifting loyalties. The empire, they explained, required men who understood both obedience and disillusionment. Men who had been broken correctly. "You can remain here," one of them said calmly. "Or you can serve again." Serve. The word landed heavily. Serve without uniform, without name, without protection. Serve an empire that had erased him and would do so again without hesitation. He asked one question. "If I refuse?" The answer was simple, honest. "You will not be remembered." That night, alone in his cell, he understood the final lesson of the prison. Loyalty was no longer about flags or oaths. It was about choosing the form of your disappearance. By morning, he knew what he would say, and in choosing survival over erasure, he stepped into a role far darker than the one he had lost. When he accepted, there was no ceremony. No papers were signed. No oath was spoken. A man simply nodded, as if a decision had been predicted long before it was made. 2 days later, the cell door opened at an hour when it never had before. He was given clean clothes. Not a uniform, never a uniform, but plain civilian garments, coarse and practical. His chains were removed slowly, deliberately, as if to remind him of their weight one last time. A barber trimmed his beard without speaking. A doctor examined him without meeting his eyes. Every gesture felt rehearsed, part of a system that had done this many times before. Before leaving the prison wing, he was allowed to walk once more through the corridor where he had spent years listening to other men breathe, suffer, and vanish. Some cells were empty now. Others held new voices, younger ones. He did not look inside. He had learned that memory could be a liability. They transported him at night. The wagon had no markings. The road was rough, winding through countryside he could not recognize. When dawn came, he saw water gray endless, and ships anchored far enough away to appear harmless. He was taken aboard a vessel that carried no flag. His crew spoke little and asked nothing. During the voyage, he was briefed. Not in the way soldiers were briefed before battle, but in fragments. Stories. Names mentioned once and never repeated. Maps drawn and burned. He learned about trade routes that existed only on paper, and treaties that existed only in blood. He learned how rebellions were seeded and how they were suffocated quietly, without martyrs. Most of all, he learned how the empire protected itself from truth. They called it service, but it resembled exile more than duty. His first assignment took him to a coastal territory officially listed as stable. Unofficially, it was on the verge of fracture. He arrived as a clerk, thin, tired, forgettable. That was intentional. Men like him were not meant to inspire loyalty or fear. They were meant to observe. He listened in taverns. He watched port records. He memorized faces and patterns. He wrote reports that said just enough to be useful and never enough to be dangerous. At night, he dreamed of stone walls and narrow windows, waking with his jaw clenched, heart racing. Freedom, he discovered, could be disorienting. He was allowed to walk wherever he wished, yet never felt unwatched. He could speak, yet measured every word. The prison had taught him silence. Service taught him restraint. Both were cages merely built from different materials. Months turned into years again, though this time he counted them. Once, during a local uprising, he was nearly exposed. A man recognized his military posture, the way he stood during gunfire. Questions were asked. Suspicion grew. Orders came swiftly. Disappear. He left the territory at night, taking nothing with him. By morning, another clerk occupied his desk. Records were altered. His name, already unofficial, was erased once more. Each mission followed the same pattern. Arrival, observation, influence, exit. He began to understand why men like him rarely returned to ordinary life. There was no place for them there. Too much knowledge, too many ghosts. Sometimes he wondered what would have happened if he had refused, if he had chosen to be forgotten. The thought brought neither regret nor relief, only curiosity. Prison had stripped him of the luxury of imagining alternate lives. As the years passed, the empire changed. Borders shifted. Flags were replaced. Ideals softened, hardened, collapsed, and reformed. Through it all, men like him remained in the shadows, adjusting, adapting, ensuring that whatever form power took, it remained intact. One night, after a particularly brutal suppression of dissent, he sat alone in a rented room, staring at his hands. They no longer shook. They had not for years. That realization unsettled him more than fear ever had. The prison had taught him how to endure suffering. Service had taught him how to cause it without emotion. And somewhere between those lessons, the man he had once been, young, loyal, convinced of honor, had quietly ceased to exist. Yet survival had a strange persistence. Despite everything, despite what he had become, a part of him still watched, still judged. A fragment that remembered why he had questioned the empire in the first place. That fragment was dangerous, and he knew it, because men like him were not meant to remember why truth mattered. They were meant only to manage its consequences. And deep within him, beneath discipline and habit, something began to stir again. Not rebellion, not yet, but the slow, inevitable weight of reckoning. The man he was sent to meet did not exist on any official register. That was how the message described him, and that alone made the assignment different. Non-existent men were either very powerful or already dead. Sometimes both. The meeting place was an abandoned customs house near a river that no longer carried commercial traffic. Its waters dark with silt and old waste. Empires often forgot places like this. That was why they mattered. He arrived before dusk, as instructed. The building smelled of rot and salt. Broken ledgers lay scattered across the floor. Their ink faded into meaningless stains. He chose a position near a cracked window and waited. Waiting had become second nature to him. In prison, waiting was punishment. In service, it was strategy. The man arrived without sound. Older than expected. Thinner too. Dressed like a merchant who had lost his luck but not his habits. His eyes, however, were sharp, assessing everything at once. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask for a name. "They sent you because you've already been erased," the man said quietly. That was not a question either. The conversation unfolded slowly. The man spoke of secret supply chains, of weapons diverted and soldiers paid twice. Once by the crown, once by those who planned to resist it. He spoke of governors who publicly pledged loyalty while privately preparing escape routes. None of it was entirely new, but the detail was unsettling. Names, dates, exact figures. This was not rebellion fueled by anger. This was administration. When the man finished, he leaned back and studied him carefully. "You'll report this," he said, "but you'll soften it. You'll recommend patience instead of force." "Why would I do that?" he asked. The man smiled faintly. "Because if you don't, they'll burn this territory clean. And you know what follows burning." He did know. Famine, disease, years of instability, the kind of chaos that created martyrs and legends. The empire preferred quiet victories. So did he, if he was honest. That night, he wrote his report exactly as predicted. Accurate, restrained, cautious. It was accepted without revision. Orders came back approving a delayed response, increased surveillance, and selective arrests. No massacres. No declarations. He had done his job well. That realization sickened him more than outright cruelty ever had. In the weeks that followed, he noticed something else. He was being tested. Assignments overlapped. Information was fed to him from different sources to see how he would reconcile contradictions. He was placed near decisions that could not be undone. Each time, the choice was subtle. Efficiency versus mercy, stability versus justice. He chose stability, every time, not because he believed in it, but because he had seen the alternative. Prison had shown him what systems did to individuals. Service showed him what individuals could do to systems if left unchecked. Still, the weight accumulated. One evening, in a provincial town far from any capital, he watched soldiers escort prisoners through a market square. The crowd was silent, eyes lowered. He recognized the look. He had worn it himself once. Not fear alone, something deeper. Resignation. That night, he dreamed of the prison again. But this time, he was not inside a cell. He was standing in the corridor, keys in his hand, deciding which doors to open and which to leave closed. He woke with his heart pounding. By now, the Empire trusted him. That was the most dangerous stage. Trust granted access. Access created responsibility. Responsibility demanded complicity. He began to understand the true shape of his punishment. The prison had confined his body. Service confined his conscience. News arrived from the capital weeks later. A shift in policy. Purge quietly planned. Men like the one he had met by the river would be removed. Permanently. The decision was framed as necessity, but he recognized fear beneath it. The Empire feared those who understood it. Too well. For the first time since his arrest years ago, he hesitated. He drafted 3 versions of his response. One endorsed the plan fully. One suggested delay. One warned carefully of consequences. He stared at the papers long into the night, aware that whichever he sent would define what kind of man he truly was now. In prison, survival had been simple, endure. In freedom, survival required choice. And choice, he was learning, was far more dangerous. As he sealed the envelope, his hand did not shake, but something inside him fractured quietly, setting the stage for a reckoning the Empire could not yet see. The response from the capital arrived weeks later, carried by a courier who asked no questions and offered no name. The seal was intact, the paper heavy, the language precise in that cold, measured way the Empire reserved for moments when it wished to sound reasonable while preparing for violence. They accepted his recommendation. Not fully, but enough. The purge was delayed. Selective investigations would begin instead. Quiet removals. Disappearances framed as transfers. Resignations. Sudden illnesses. The Empire, as always, chose efficiency over spectacle. He should have felt relief. Instead, he felt watched. From that moment, his assignments changed in tone. Where before he had been asked to observe, now he was asked to participate. Interviews that were not interrogations yet carried the same weight. Reports that did not merely describe events, but shaped outcomes. Names he once recorded neutrally were now marked with subtle annotations. Cooperative, unreliable, potentially dangerous. He realized then that he had crossed another threshold. He was no longer merely a tool. He was becoming a filter through. The territory he was sent to next lay inland, far from ports and official attention. On maps it appeared orderly. Districts marked cleanly, borders straight, administrative notes confident. On the ground it was frayed, villages half abandoned, roads repaired just enough to keep wagons moving. A place held together by habit rather than belief. He arrived under another name. By now, names meant little to him. They were coats one wore until they became inconvenient. Still, this one felt heavier. Perhaps because the assignment attached consequences more permanent than before. His task was simple in description and vast in implication. Assess loyalty. He was not there to uncover rebellion. He was there to justify what had already been decided. Late one evening, while returning to his lodging, he noticed he was being followed. The footsteps were careful but inexperienced. He turned sharply into an alley and waited. A boy emerged, no older than 16. Terrified, shaking, clutching a folded piece of paper like a lifeline. "I was told to give you this," the boy whispered. They said you would understand." Before he could ask who they were, the boy ran. Inside the paper was a list of names. Teachers, dock workers, a midwife, a former soldier, ordinary people. At the bottom was a date 3 days away, and a single word written harder than the rest, as if pressed into the page with anger. Removal. He felt the old prison cold crawl up his spine. That night, sleep refused him. He sat by the window watching lanterns sway in the distance, thinking about systems, about how violence did not need hatred, only process. By morning he had a choice. If he reported the list, the removals would proceed quickly and quietly. No resistance, no questions. If he suppressed it, the district administrator would eventually discover the omission, and suspicion would fall on him. There was a third option, dangerous, unofficial, unrecorded. He began visiting the names on the list, not warning them directly, that would spark panic, but asking questions, listening, measuring who already knew their fate and who still believed in routine. He found no rebels, no conspirators, only people who remembered too much, spoke too honestly, or had once hesitated when asked to comply. By the second day he realized something worse. Some of the names were already dead. Their deaths had simply not been acknowledged yet. On the third night the removals began. Wagons moved without lamps. Doors opened without noise. People vanished from beds that were still warm. No screams echoed. No witnesses spoke. By dawn, the district felt lighter, as if something heavy had been carried away. He submitted his report that afternoon. It was brief, accurate, devastating. The Empire approved immediate stabilization measures. Commendations were hinted at. Future assignments promised. He read the response twice, then burned it. That night, he walked beyond the town limits, into the fields where crops struggled in tired soil. He stood there for a long time, listening to the wind move through stalks that would soon be harvested by hands that no longer belonged to the dead. For the first time since his imprisonment years ago, he felt something close to panic. Not fear of punishment, but fear of continuation. He understood now. This was not about loyalty or betrayal anymore. It was about momentum. Once you became part of the machine, stopping felt like destruction. Not just of the system, but of yourself. Everything he had done to survive had led him here, to a place where survival demanded becoming something unrecognizable. And yet, beneath that realization, another thought formed. Quiet, dangerous, persistent. Machines depended on silence. And silence, once broken, could never fully be restored. As he turned back toward the town, he knew Part 8 would not be about observation or choice. The town never spoke of the disappearances. That silence was not accidental. It was cultivated. By morning, the houses of the removed were sealed with official notices citing relocation, health concerns, or administrative correction. Curtains were left hanging. Shoes remained by doorways. A cup of water sat unfinished on a table in one home, slowly collecting dust as the days passed. No one entered. No one asked why. Children learned quickly which desks would stay empty. The market adjusted itself. A butcher took over another man's stall. A midwife's duties were quietly reassigned. The Empire had perfected replacement. Loss was absorbed before grief could form. He watched all of it with a growing sense of dread that no longer felt sharp, but heavy, like wet soil pressing down on a coffin. That afternoon, he walked through the square and noticed something new. People were avoiding him. Not openly, not obviously, just enough. Conversations stopped a second earlier than they should have. I shifted away. A woman clutched her child tighter as he passed. They knew, not who he truly was, but what he represented. He had become a signal. That night, the administrator summoned him again. The office was brighter than usual. Fresh candles, clean glasses, a decanter of wine set deliberately between them, as if to suggest equality. The administrator smiled more openly now, no longer cautious. "You understand this region," the man said. "That's rare." He nodded. "Stability has improved. Productivity is up. Complaints are down." Of course they were. The administrator leaned forward. "The capital wants to expand this model." That sentence carried more weight than a threat. "They want you to oversee the transition." There it was. Not merely to observe or report, but to design. He felt something inside him recoil. Not fear. Recognition. This was the moment when participation turned into authorship. When you could no longer pretend the machine existed without you. "I'll need time," he said carefully. You'll have it, the administrator replied. But understand, others are eager. Men who would not hesitate. That was the empire's gentlest pressure. If not you, someone worse. That argument had kept many horrors alive. He left the office and walked until the town disappeared behind him. Beyond the last buildings, the land flattened into open fields, broken only by the outlines of abandoned farms. The wind carried no voices here, only insects, only the sound of life continuing without concern for human systems. He remembered the prison. Not the pain, not the hunger, but the clarity. In prison, there had been no illusions. Power was visible. Violence was honest. Survival was simple. Endure or disappear. Out here, violence wore paperwork. Power smiled. Survival required cooperation. That was far worse. 2 days later, another list arrived. Longer this time. Not only names but families, associations, secondary contacts, preventative considerations. The document called them. The language was careful, almost elegant. This was no longer punishment. It was preemption. He read the list slowly, then folded it and placed it in his coat without comment. That night, he did something he had never done before. He returned to one of the sealed houses. The door resisted at first, then gave way with a soft crack. Inside, the air was stale. Everything was as it had been left. A child's wooden toy lay on the floor. A coat hung by the door. He stood there for a long time. Then he began to search. He found letters hidden beneath floorboards. Notes written in careful script. Records of small meetings, quiet conversations, shared doubts. Nothing violent. Nothing organized. Just people thinking together. That was the crime. The empire did not fear rebellion. It feared connection. He burned the papers in the hearth and watched the flames consume names, hopes, unfinished thoughts. As the smoke rose, he felt something shift inside him. Not guilt, not relief, but a deeper understanding. These people had never stood a chance. Nor, he realized, did he. The next morning, he altered his report. Not by lying outright, but by misdirecting. Emphasizing unreliable sources. Questioning credibility. Suggesting surveillance instead of action. Delays instead of removals. It was a risk. One he knew would not go unnoticed forever. That evening, a messenger arrived unexpectedly. Not from the administrator. Not from the capital. From the prison. The seal was familiar. Too familiar. The message was brief. They remember you, and they are watching. He folded the note carefully and destroyed it. For the first time since his release, he understood the full shape of his situation. He was not free. He was not loyal. He was not forgiven. He was contained. Used where useful. Monitored where dangerous. Disposable the moment he became inconvenient. The empire did not erase its prisoners. It released them carefully so they could erase others. As night fell, he stood by the window and looked out at the quiet town. Somewhere behind those walls were people who would vanish next. Somewhere beyond the horizon were men who would sign orders without ever seeing faces. And somewhere deep inside him, something began to harden. Not into obedience, but into resolve. Not rebellion. Not yet. But the slow, irreversible understanding that survival at any cost eventually demanded a cost too high to pay. And when that moment came, there would be no middle path left. Only action. Only consequence. Only ruin. The first mistake he made was thinking he still had time. Time had always been his ally. Time to observe, time to soften reports, time to delay outcomes just long enough to matter. But the empire did not reward hesitation forever. It noticed patterns. And patterns, once identified, were corrected. The correction came quietly. It began with a reassignment notice delivered without ceremony. He was to remain in the region, but his authority would now be supported. A second man arrived 3 days later, introduced as an administrative aide. Younger, polished, efficient. His questions were sharper than necessary. His smile did not reach his eyes. From the first conversation, it was clear. This man was not here to learn. He was here to measure. They worked side by side, reviewing records, visiting villages, conducting interviews. The aide never contradicted him openly, never challenged a decision directly. Instead, he took notes, too many notes. He asked for copies of reports that had previously remained local. He requested access to correspondence that had never been shared upward before. The walls began to close. He adjusted his behavior carefully, became more neutral, less cautious, allowed one removal to proceed without objection, approved an investigation he would once have delayed. The aide observed all of it, nodding occasionally as if pleased. That pleased him even less. At night he slept poorly, not from fear of arrest but from the pressure of calculation. Every action now carried two weights: its consequence and how it would be interpreted. The prison had taught him endurance. Service had taught him strategy. Now he needed something else entirely: anticipation. The opportunity arrived sooner than expected. One evening, as they returned from a distant district, the aide suggested a drink. A local tavern. Public, noisy, safe. Or so it appeared. They sat at a corner table while merchants and laborers filled the room with forced laughter. The aide spoke casually about the empire, about reform, about efficiency, about loyalty. Some men, he said lightly, confuse restraint with resistance. He met his gaze and held it. You don't, the aide continued. You understand necessity. He said nothing. The aide smiled. Good, because the capital is watching this region closely now. Mistakes would be unfortunate. That night, he knew the end of the middle path had arrived. 2 days later, a name appeared on a list that should not have been there. The old prisoner. The man who had spoken to him through the wall years ago. The one who had explained the purpose of the prison. Somehow, impossibly, he had survived long enough to be moved, transferred under another identity to this very region. The empire had placed them near each other deliberately. This was not coincidence. It was bait. The removal order was clear. Final. No delay authorized. He stared at the document for a long time, feeling the last illusion of control crumble. The empire was not merely watching him anymore. It was testing his limits. That night, he went to the location listed, a remote holding facility disguised as a labor depot. He requested entry under his authority. The guards hesitated, then complied. Inside, he found the old man thinner, weaker, but unmistakable. Their eyes met in recognition. No words were exchanged. Later, alone, he understood the truth fully. The empire was forcing a decision. If he allowed the removal, he proved loyalty and erased the last living witness to his past. If he intervened, even subtly, he revealed attachment, and attachment was dangerous. He chose neither. Instead, he altered the route. Paperwork was rerouted. Transportation schedules adjusted. Guards reassigned. The old man was moved, not freed, but misplaced. Lost in bureaucracy, a shadow between ledgers. It was a small act. And it was enough. The aide noticed. The next morning, questions came. Polite, repetitive, the same information requested in slightly different forms. He answered calmly, aware that every word was being weighed against others he had already spoken. By evening, the aide was gone, recalled, officially, replaced by silence. That silence was worse. 3 nights later, soldiers arrived at his lodging. Not guards. Not police, military. They did not restrain him. They did not accuse him. They simply informed him that he was to be relocated immediately for consultation. As he was escorted through the darkened streets, he saw lights flicker behind curtains. People watching, remembering. He wondered if any of them would survive long enough to regret it. The wagon moved toward the outskirts of town, toward the old roads, toward the places maps no longer cared to describe. He did not resist. Resistance would have confirmed guilt. But as the town disappeared behind him, he understood something essential. This was no longer about survival. This was about exit. The empire had decided he was no longer predictable. And unpredictable men were not corrected. They were removed. As the wheels carried him back toward the machinery, he thought he had escaped. One final certainty settled in his mind. If he survived this, it would not be by compliance. It would be by destruction, careful, deliberate, and irreversible. The wagon did not stop where prisons usually waited. That was the first sign. There were no walls rising from the earth, no towers, no iron gates announcing captivity. Instead, the road narrowed into forest, the trees growing denser, older, their branches tangled like memories that refused to decay. The soldiers said nothing. They did not need to. Silence itself had become procedure. When the wagon finally halted, dawn was beginning to bleed into the sky. Pale light filtered through mist, revealing a compound so understated it would have vanished from memory if not for the men guarding it. No flags, no insignia, just stone buildings half swallowed by earth, their windows narrow and dark. This place did not exist on maps. He understood immediately. This was where the Empire sent problems that could not be tried, corrected, or publicly erased. Men who knew too much. Men who had served too long. Men whose loyalty had become complicated. Inside, he was stripped of rank without ceremony. No declaration. No charges. His uniform was taken as if it were borrowed property. In its place, coarse cloth. Familiar. Heavy. Purposefully uncomfortable. The door closed behind him with a sound he recognized down to the marrow of his bones. He was a prisoner again. The cell was smaller than the first one he had survived years ago, but cleaner. No rot. No screams. That too was deliberate. This prison was not designed to break bodies. It was designed to erase context. Days passed without clocks. Meals arrived without pattern. Questions came without warning. They never asked about the missing prisoner. They never asked about altered records. They asked about philosophy, about governance, about necessity. They asked whether order mattered more than mercy, whether peace justified cruelty, whether loyalty could survive doubt. Every answer he gave was measured, balanced, acceptable. Still, he remained. Weeks turned into months, or perhaps months into years. Time lost meaning in a place that existed only to suspend it. He learned the rhythms of the guards, the moments when footsteps slowed, when attention wandered. He observed not for escape, but for understanding. And slowly, the truth revealed itself. The Empire had not brought him here to punish him. It had brought him here to decide what to do with him. Men like him were rare, useful, dangerous. The Empire feared executing such men openly. It invited questions. It feared releasing them. It invited influence. So it waited, studied, calculated. One evening, the interrogator changed. An older man entered the cell alone. No guards, no ledger. He spoke without preamble. "You were loyal," the man said. "You were effective. And then you began to hesitate." He did not deny it. The man continued. "Hesitation spreads. Quietly. It looks like compassion. It sounds like reason. But it infects others." Silence followed. "However," the man added, "you also understand the system better than most. You know where it bends, where it fractures." He felt the shape of the offer before it was spoken. "You can return," the man said. "Not as you were. Something quieter. Something narrower. You will never command again. You will never decide policy. But you will serve." "And if I refuse?" he asked. The man smiled thinly. "Then you will remain here until you are forgotten, which takes longer than death." That night he did not sleep. Not because of fear, because he finally understood the final cruelty of the Empire. It did not only destroy enemies, it consumed survivors. He accepted the offer. Weeks later, he left the compound under a different name, a lesser role, a shadow position buried deep within the logistical machinery of the Empire. He was placed where records flowed, where decisions were translated into numbers, where removals became shipments and lives became margins.